I'm here to talk about a letter that I just received from the Coco Scrabble organization about Chris Lipe making a complaint against me and about them banning me for life because of this complaint. And I'm going to go into some detail here, and I do want to say some things specifically to Chris Lipe, but I also want to be clear from the outset that make a disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer. And I have been embroiled in a lot of legal stuff, and I've learned a fair amount about the law because I've had to while I was representing myself pro se. And I'm going to give my best opinions about the legal issues at hand, but I also want to be clear that none of this should be construed as legal advice, and none of this should be construed that I know what the heck I'm doing in terms of representing myself. I simply was forced into that situation because I didn't have a lawyer and couldn't afford a lawyer. But I'm going to give my good faith best impression of things and let you know where things stand in terms of how I perceive things. And I'm also going to include a link to a full copy of this letter that I received from Coco today with all the details of it. And I'm not trying to misrepresent or distort their side of the story and their point of view in any way, shape, or form, just to talk about where I think things are objectively at. It is also the case, I want to tell you, that there's a lot about this story, in my opinion, and about my conflict with Chris Lipe that is actually about something much more big and universal than about Scrabble and people playing Scrabble tournaments and for Scrabble associations, and about any of the political fights between these organizations and each other or between these organizations and me. And that much more universal concept, which is really key here, is the idea of moral relativism versus moral objectivity. Quite simply, Chris Lipe is a moral relativist, and it is one of the things I disdain most about him. And maybe some of his friends are too. I can't say I have as much insight into their worldview on these issues as I do into his. But I want to be clear that I am a moral objectivist, and I don't mean objectivist in like the Ayn Rand sense of the world. Maybe I need a better term for that. I think I've used the word moral absolutism as well in the past. So I'm not sure what the correct philosophy terminology is, but this is a bit of a philosophical argument I'm going to talk about here. And what it really gets to the heart of it is that the moral measure of your actions is not measured by your perception of the world. It is measured by how the world actually is objectively. So however much you misperceive the world, misperceive certain situations, and come to judgments about the morality of your actions or the morality of other people's actions, if you have failed to perceive the world accurately, that is your own moral failure. That is something that you are culpable for. So I want to be clear here. The main idea of this banning, and I said I will give you the wording of the full document in the description, it is pretty similar to the argument that John Chu gave me for why he gave me a lifetime ban from NASPA for what I said to Chris Lipe. But if there's any new information in this document, the key thing is that it claims that my communication directly to Chris Lipe in a private message was understood by the recipient as a death threat. So it's using his perception of this as a justification for treating me as if I'm making death threats. Now, I want to be very clear. I don't know whether that's an honest statement or not. It might very well be the case that Chris perceived this particular communication from me as a death threat. It might not. It might be that he's also playing a role of believing that it is and saying that he believes it is because it strengthens their legal arguments. And I have zero doubt that both the people at Coco and John Chu and the people at NASPA consulted lawyers heavily before they contacted me with any of this stuff. So they are looking at this not just in terms of what they think is objectively true, but what legally they can get away with if this gets to a point of litigation. And I don't think it's actually going to get to a point of litigation. Maybe it will. I think if they tried to take me to court in some way, it would backfire spectacularly. And I want to be very clear about that. The reason is because I am judgment-proof now. I essentially have no money besides assets that are in retirement accounts. So if you were to try to take me to civil court and extract money from me, there's no money you could get. There's no money the law would be allowed to take away from me. And in fact, the exact reasons that I am in this financially bad situation of being judgment-proof are because of the abuse of not just the Clinchies, but people like Chris Lipe and John Chu also, for the ways in which they did so much emotional damage to me that it derailed my career, in addition to the ways in which it got me kicked out of Scrabble. So I am in this sort of desperate situation where I have nothing to lose. At the same time, like, this is very much their fault that I'm in that situation, and they might try to cling to another worldview that denies that. But all of this is really about the perception game, and I want to be careful about that, is that I have already made very unequivocal statements that I am never going to play for Coco or for NASPA again, as long as John Chu is the president of NASPA. It is potentially possible, if NASPA underwent some changes and he was no longer in a leadership position, that I might go back and support NASPA then. I think that's a rather unlikely outcome, but I'm allowing for that possibility. But it is certainly the case that I'm never going to play for Coco, and the organizers of Coco have zero doubt about this. They know that. Like, this was literally started by the people who started this campaign to destroy my life and reputation. I've never had any interest in playing in Coco tournaments. So banning me for life doesn't actually have any effect on me. You're telling me that I'm not allowed to go to tournaments that I already had zero intention of going to. So let's be clear about why you're doing this. Why you're doing this is to try to keep this false narrative alive, that your story, your side of the story, is in any way valid, and that I'm a freaking monster, and get people to perceive that. And also potentially to influence other organizations like WESPA into banning me as well. Or at least into officially sanctioning tournaments in your organization while I am banned from that organization. So I want to be really, really clear on this, that you're playing this perception game, but really, if anyone's in any legal jeopardy as a result of all of this, it is you. The reason is, as I said, I'm judgment proof. And it is also the case that I've already started providing a ton of evidence of the ways in which you all have defamed me. And I strongly believe if I had competent representation, if I had the money to carry the lawsuit through to the conclusion in the beginning, then not only would all these people have been found guilty of defamation, it is quite possible that Discovery might have turned over documents that also actually would have caused Chris Lipe to be guilty of defamation, or guilty of some sort of conspiracy with them. Now, that is notwithstanding the fact that I was suing in Oregon, where civil conspiracy is apparently not a valid charge, and that was my own bad, or my lawyer's bad, Mark Mohan, in misunderstanding that situation. But there was still the possibility that some of this goes to a federal court or to another court system where there actually are civil conspiracies, and I might be able to show not only defamation but also conspiracy to defame. So I want to be clear here that the main legal justification for why their suit was dismissed and they got away with defaming me was this idea of qualified immunity, which is that organizations can have their own disciplinary processes, and nothing said in that is generally eligible for defamation, because they don't want to sort of silence whistleblowers, silence people who have something important to speak of, even if they overstated the case or didn't make their case well. They don't want to, the law doesn't want to discourage these kind of disciplinary processes from happening, right? However, considering that I have zero intention to play in Coco tournaments, and I never have had before, and considering that I've already made publicly clear that I have zero intention to play in NASPA tournaments going forward as long as John Chu is running it, it is the case that your attempt to ban me is meaningless, and the only real motive you can have, other than just in the perception game playing these perceptions, is in trying to influence other organizations outside of yourself, such as WESPA, to ban me too, or to take your ban seriously, or to make my life more difficult on account of all of that. And any way that your organization is influencing another organization outside of this is really going to completely invalidate qualified immunity. It means that you don't have the qualified immunity defense of your behavior. So if you actually successfully influence WESPA or another organization to do wrong to me while I've already turned my back into organizations and you're continuing to spew these false narratives, I might actually very well have a new case for defamation or other lawsuits against you for reputational damage. And in my opinion, the document you've given me is actually more evidence that can be held against you. Held against you for defaming me, for continuing to double down on your lies. Now, maybe it's a matter of the lawyers and the impression a particular jury gets. Maybe if we both sued and countersued each other for defamation or things like that, you would win, I would win, neither would win. I don't know. I don't want to go that route. I don't want to give a whole lot more money to the lawyers. But I also want to be really clear that trying to make this litigious is a losing battle for you because there is no money to take from me anymore because of your abuse. And there is potentially money to take away from you or your organizations. So continuing to fight an endless war against me can only hurt you more than it hurts me. I really wish we all could have just talked about some of this shit reasonably a long time ago. Evans and Jennifer, if you had talked to me, just had a reasonable conversation with me at any time over the last several years, you would have found I was very reasonable to deal with, and I might have very well been willing to take down a lot of the more embarrassing material to you off of blogs. Now, I want to be clear, I made those original posts on the blogs to hold you accountable for certain things, but pretty much everything I posted after those first two posts was not about holding you accountable, it's holding these Scrabble organizations accountable. And I'm not counting Coco, because Coco is not a real Scrabble organization. But the ways that WIGPO, the ways that NASPA, and the ways that WESPA mistreated me, I need to hold their leaders to account, and that's why I made all this stuff public. But if you and I had been willing to have a conversation, and you had actually been willing to walk back some of your statements and make me whole in terms of my reputation, I would have been very willing to take down a lot of the more personally embarrassing material about you, and even write new things on the blog that actually cast you in a much more positive light. We could have actually started working together collaboratively on this rather than competitively trying to destroy each other's lives. You are the ones who are insisting on this binary war of either he goes or we go. There is no coexistence of us. And my answer to that is if that's what you insist on, you're going to lose. It might take forever, but you're going to lose for a few simple reasons. I never give up. As long as I am still alive, I'm going to keep fighting for my good name and for the truth to be out there, and it eventually will be out there. Furthermore, I want to say one other thing to you, Chris. Again, I don't know if you're saying the truth about whether you understood this thing as a death threat at the time, and I really don't care. I have given more explanation of that on the blog now, of how I was just talking about the death of your reputation. But regardless of that, I want to be really clear here that you had many, many times when you could have talked to me in a reasonable way about things, and you turned down opportunities for that dialogue and chose to just abuse me from afar and to influence other people behind my back to wreck my life, and kept me out of conversations, out of the room, while you and other people were making decisions where I was the biggest stakeholder, where my skin was in the game more than anyone else's. It is very much the case. I understand what is quoted in this article, this letter, in terms of you can perhaps legally conceive of my communications toward Chris as violating an anti-harassment policy in terms of being unwanted verbal, visual, written, or physical conduct that seriously scares, annoys, demeans, harasses, embarrasses, or humiliates someone. So I want to be really clear here, Chris. You can make an argument that I did that, but I can also make an argument that you harassed me for a long time, for years, before I did anything that was harassing of you. It's quite simply the fact that your unethical and dishonest spinning of all of these stories, of which I have a whole bunch of screenshots of stuff, did cause massive emotional trauma to me, massive loss of reputation, massive embarrassment and humiliation. It was very demeaning to me. It was harassing to me, right? So who's the bigger harasser here? I mean, some of that is a matter of perception, but there's no question that you started that harassment long before I did. You started it in the year 2020 when I first started publishing this blog. You're not going to find a single evidence of anything I said to you that you could successfully construe as harassing until after my court case was already thrown out in 2023. So you had at least a 3-year head start, if not longer than that, on harassing, demeaning me, on causing me tons and tons of damage. Now, I stand by, I did not say anything wrong in that communication to you. I did not make a death threat. In fact, I literally said that this is not a threat, this is just me reading the future as best as I can see it. And the only way you can construe that as a death threat is to say, I literally don't believe what Dave is saying, and I am going to interpret subtext rather than actual literal text. And I don't know, I think I've given a lot of evidence over this whole story of how literal I am, of how honest I am, and when I say things are not a threat, I mean they are not a threat, and I am, quite simply, one of the most honest people in the world with zero history of physical violence. So, keep spinning however you want to, but I think you're just fighting a losing battle there. So, that's that. Again, I'm not a lawyer. Don't take any of this as legal advice. But I want to also be clear, Chris, there was a time when I was really mad at you, much more so than now. And I'll be honest, like, I hate you, Chris. I think you're literally one of the most loathsome human beings on the planet. But I'm not particularly mad at you right now. I was much more mad at you up until April 14th, 2022, when I first started receiving all these documents from Steve Pellinen and from NASPA with all these accusations. Because I was stuck in a situation where you were spinning things from 2017, really, or especially 2020, going forward, that was making me look like a bad guy. While I wasn't doing anything wrong, I wasn't behaving in any kind of harassing way whatsoever. And you were doing this, and you were causing tons of emotional damage to me. You were causing tons of reputational damage to me. You caused the loss of my career and all of my income. And I did not make a literal death threat on you, but you could argue that I caused you emotional damage in doing that. Well, guess what? You caused me emotional damage too. You caused me reputational damage. And I'm going to continue causing you reputational damage by calling out your record as a Scrabble politician, everything you've done. But I'm only going to do it by telling the truth, unlike you who did it by lying. So here's the thing. I am going to make sure that all of the punishment I mete out to people like you and to people like John Chu is only commensurate with the damage you have already done to me. I am never going to overstep and cause you damage in any way to your life beyond the damage that you've already done to me, which is emotional damage, which is career damage, which is reputational damage, which is all these kinds of damage. It is fair game for me to tell the truth and cause damage to you in the exact same ways that you cause damage to me by telling lies. And that is all I have to say for now. I will go into more detail about your political record later, Chris, when I'm good and ready.